Now may I invite Major General Ahmed Mohamed to kindly join us on the dais. Major General Ahmed Mohamed is the Chief of Training and Operations, Nigerian Army. He has immense experience in dealing with radical outfits like Boko Haram. Now may I request Shekhar Sinha sir to kindly begin the proceedings. Over to you, sir.
Good morning, distinguished guests. I know for some people it is early because they're still trickling in, but let's begin. When we analyze this manner in which the terrorist organizations work, particularly here in our own India Foundation researchers, and I think researchers all over the world, we come to conclude that it is something beyond just violence and organized violence. The longevity of the terrorist outfits are always driven by a central theme or an ideology which creates a passion amongst the practitioners which takes them beyond the ordinary grades of violence. It becomes a much bigger issue. Simple violences may achieve very few simple goals, possibly a political goal. You want to change the system for the time being and let it function the way it is. Or once you have achieved your limited political objective, you get on with your life. But the sustainability of these political goals or sustainability of these ideologies can hardly be sustained unless something binds them. The low-scale violence for achievement of political goals can be best described by the example of the Irish Republican Army in the years gone by. In a manner of speaking, it was also following an ideology, but the ideology was that of political tribalism, if you like. But after the Cold War, terrorism reflects the concept of ideology as the driving force. If you look at Al-Qaeda, what has it done? It has pragmatically followed an ideology which cemented its ranks and cadres and motivated them and undertook opposition to the established orders in their own area of operation. And 9/11 can be said as one of the best examples, as a flagship operation as far as Al-Qaeda is concerned. Today, even the states who sponsor terrorism as a tool of state policy do employ these radical ideologies as a major motivating factor and a binding character of their cadres and people who are actually employed in the field. For the students who constantly study and research terrorism, need to look at the threads of commonality between the first terror attack or first sign of violence that takes place in a new area and compare it with those which is being practiced by the established terror groups in the world. Otherwise, you might just miss it and something can go unchecked and that violence can turn into a full-fledged terrorism. If commonality is not established in the early days, the incident may be wrongly set aside as one-off violent incident, which can be very, very detrimental to the security of that part of the world. Today, most of the terrorist groups are bound by this sort of ideology, but they could be known by different names in different parts of the world. It has become transnational and totally global, cutting across all the state boundaries. To examine some of these ideological challenges that Nigeria faces today, particularly with Boko Haram, let me invite Major General Ahmed Mohamed of the Nigerian Army. He has more than 25 years of service, and he's a serving officer, heading the Chief of Training and Operations. He's an infantry officer with very long years of experience in handling of terrorism. Major General Mohamed.
Good morning, all. Let me start by thanking the Indian government for giving us the opportunity to come on this all-important gathering to state part of our case in relation to ongoing operations against terrorism in our country. As you are all aware, the war of terror in Nigeria is also an ideological one. So for this reason, in the course of my presentation, I'm going to use Boko Haram terrorism in Nigeria as a case study. By way of introduction, armed conflict prior to the Cold War era was seen as war between sovereign states, but since the end of the Cold War, the phenomenon armed conflict has transformed into the rise of non-state actors, mostly against their own government. Insurgency, which has been seen as the most common type of armed conflict, has posed the greatest threat to global peace and security in the 21st century. Few years ago, insurgency was limited to a few isolated places, such as Northern Ireland, the Basque Country in northern Spain, and some areas in the Middle East. But due to the aftermath of September 11, 2001 attacks, as well as the rise of the Arab Spring, insurgency has degenerated into a global menace. The prevalence of extreme ideologies buoyed by readily available arms has emboldened criminal and terrorist networks in their violent activities and insurgencies. Poverty and inequality is still endemic in Africa, which continues to alter the distribution of wealth. Consequently, the greatest threats to security for many people today are domestic, especially poverty, inequality, civil war, and state-sponsored violence, or transnational crime, terrorism, disease, and environmental. As we would all observe, the activities of violent extremist groups operating with support from global terrorist groups such as Islamic State and Al-Qaeda have had ripple effects across the Sahel region, bringing about conflicts and now a sense of threat to Africa's peace and stability. The most devastating effects of these insurgencies all over the world have been the proliferation of small arms and light weapons, high toll of human crisis in the form of astronomical rise in internally displaced persons, refugee influx, food insecurity, spread of disease, as well as gender and sexual-based violence. The phenomena of insurgency in Nigeria has been evident since independence in 1960, ranging from the 12-day revolution by Adakaboro in 1964 to the Nigerian Civil War between 1967 and 1970, and violent activities of various ethnic militia such as Odua People's Congress, the movement for the actualization of the sovereign state of Biafra, the movement for the emancipation of Niger Delta, and most recent, the Jama'atu al-Sunnah Lidawati wal Jihad, popularly known as Boko Haram, which has been operating in northern Nigeria since 2002. Boko Haram activities have brought widespread of socio-economic and religious insecurity and unleashed terrible humanitarian crises in certain communities in the northern parts of Nigeria. The Northeast region is experiencing dire humanitarian situation as evident in human casualties, human rights abuses, population displacement, and refugee debacle, loss of means of livelihood, food insecurity, limited medical facilities, and other social amenities. The increasing influx of refugees and spillover of Boko Haram violence to neighboring countries over the years had resulted to serious regional insecurity implications and thus giving it international coloration. The federal government of Nigeria has instituted a lot of civil and military measures to ameliorate the consequence of Boko Haram insurgencies in the Northeast. Some of the civil measures are the Victim Support Fund, Ad hoc Committee for Dialogue and Reconciliation in Northern Nigeria, Committee for the Rehabilitation of Liberated Communities in the Northeast, to mention but a few. In the same vein, military measures are being emplaced to restore peace and security and ensure maintenance of law and order in the region. At the moment, a 3-division joint task force, Operation Lafia Dole, is operating in the Northeast. Operation Lafia Dole has greatly decimated, incapacitated, and reduced Boko Haram capability to launch a sustained battle as it hitherto did a few years back. As a result of the effective military action, the ability of the insurgents to launch a coordinated attack has been greatly degraded. On the whole, the Boko Haram insurgency has tasked the response mechanism of government and security agencies. This may not be unconnected to the active support and collaboration the group receives from external sources and other prominent citizens as its expertise in manipulating the average citizens through propaganda in areas where the group operates. The purpose of this presentation, therefore, is to appraise the activities of Boko Haram on Nigerian national security. The subject of this presentation is limited to an appraisal of Boko Haram as a terrorist group in Nigeria and will cover recent activities of Boko Haram, its manifestation, effects, and challenges to security agencies and government efforts at combating the menace. In this presentation, the term Boko Haram insurgents and Boko Haram terrorists will be used interchangeably. This brings me to the aim of this presentation, which is to appraise Boko Haram insurgency and government intervention program to curtail the insurgency. To do this, I will cover the manifestation of Boko Haram insurgency in Nigeria, effects of insurgency on socio-economic and political environment in northeastern Nigeria, response to Boko Haram insurgency in Nigeria, challenges, and the way forward. Let me start with the manifestation of the Boko Haram sect. Boko Haram is an Islamic sect formed in 2002 in Maiduguri under the leadership of Mohamed as a local radical Salafist group and later transformed into a Salafist jihadist terror organization in 2009. The phrase Boko Haram is derived from a combination of Hausa word Boko, meaning book, and Arabic word Haram, forbidden. So this means Western education is forbidden. Boko Haram is called Jama'atu al-Sunnah Lidawati wal Jihad, meaning people committed to the propagation of the Prophet's teachings and jihad. The ideology of the sect under Mohamed Yusuf was basically the opposition of Western education and political philosophy, which sought to overthrow the government and implement Sharia throughout the country. The perception of Boko Haram is that the system of government based on Western values is responsible for corruption, poverty, unemployment, and continued suppression of true Islam. Boko Haram, like other Salafi jihadist sects, has demonstrated the ability to master a wide range of tactics. Essentially, the sect has two basic tactical methods: individual or the small group, with focus on individualized terror, such as assassinations, drive-by shooting, and local terror, and massive concerted attacks, usually highly mobile, utilizing motorcycles and mounted trucks to attack smaller or comparatively less defended targets and then massacring the target population. In addition to these two tactical methods, Boko Haram has perfected the use of improvised explosive devices, both person and vehicular borne, including the use of young male and female suicide bombers, The sect abducts young able-bodied men to swell its rank and young women and girls who are used as sex slaves. The target of Boko Haram attacks are schools, worship centers, recreational centers, markets, motor parks, military and security establishments, troops positions, government institutions, and public buildings, to mention but a few. Funding for Boko Haram comes from discrete external funding, bank robberies, kidnapping for ransom, cattle wrestling, sales of fish, and smuggling. Initially, the sect captured some of its weapons from the military and security forces. There are likelihood that most of its arms and ammunition come in from Libya, Mali, and South Sudan. Boko Haram also has a splinter group referred to as Ansaru. Ansaru means Vanguard for the Protection of Muslims. The splinter group broke out of Boko Haram because of the latter's frequent killings of Muslims. Ansaru avoids Muslim casualties. Instead, it actively attacks Christian worship places and government officials. Further factionalization within Boko Haram sect also led to the recognition of another leader, Abu Musab Habib bin Mohamed bin Yusuf al-Barnawi, in place of Abu Bakr Shekau, especially by Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Al-Barnawi is the son of the original founder of Boko Haram, Mohamed Yusuf, and he is more active in the Lake Chad Basin and parts of Yobe State. Terrorism and insurgency are not new phenomena in Nigeria. These phenomena predate the independence, but they have attained a new dimension wherein international outlook based on the linkages between other terrorist groups in West African sub-region and other parts of Africa. The contemporary Boko Haram insurgency Nigeria is grappling with reared its head in 2002 amidst the introduction of Sharia law in some northern states. The set got started in Borno State by a group of educated and uneducated Islamic peoples referred to as Muhajirun movement or the Nigerian Taliban. The set's objective was to create an Islamic state first in areas around Kanama and Toshia and then all over Nigeria. However, in 2004, Boko Haram became militant in its approach by attacking police stations to seize weapons. Consequently, limited operations were conducted to halt the sex exploit, leaving about 20 members killed, while 50 others were arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned. As a result of the emergence of militancy in the Niger Delta about the same time, intensity of the operation against Boko Haram was reduced to enable a considerable force to be applied in the region. Between 2003 and 2009, when the fight against militancy in the Niger Delta was at its peak, Boko Haram was waxing stronger and its activities were prominent in Adamawa, Bauchi, Borno, Gombe, Kaduna, Kano, and Yoba states, with presence in Kogi, Plateau, and Sokoto states. Boko Haram footsteps were also observed in southwestern Nigeria, especially Lagos and Ogun states, where insurgents who escaped from the heat in the northeast took refuge. Additionally, the sect extended its operations to border communities between Nigeria, Nigeria's neighboring countries, such as Cameroon, Chad, and Niger. After the death of Mohamed Yusuf in 2009, Malam Abubakar Shekau emerged as the leader of the sects and its activities became more violent. Between 2009 and 2014, the sect attacked army barracks in Abuja and Bauchi and the headquarters 1 division, as well as the police force headquarters, the United Nations building, and this day newspaper's office in Abuja. The sect also attacked several churches, mosques, markets, schools, and recreational centers, as well as political and religious processions across the northern states. Boko Haram is responsible for the death of over 20,000 people, including civilians, military, and security personnel, destruction of several communities, which has caused dislocation of people from their natural abode and denial of livelihood. Boko Haram abducted several girls and women, including the 279 schoolgirls kidnapped in Chibok, Borno State, on the 14th of April 2014. The sect has also kidnapped a number of foreign nationals, including German and French expatriates, as well as the wife of Cameroonian Vice Prime Minister. Boko Haram continues to abduct and coerce young able-bodied boys to swell its rank. Since 2014, Boko Haram has increased its use of suicide bombers, including young girls whom investigations have revealed are mostly drugged and forced to go for suicide missions. So far, not less than 80 cases of suicide bombings by young female suicide bombers have been recorded between January and December 2017. In April 2014, ISIS accepted Boko Haram's allegiance and named the sect Islamic State in West African province, ISWAP. 3 months after, in July 2014, Boko Haram declared the 27 local governments, comprising 6 in Adamawa, 14 Borno, and 7 in Yobe states, under its control, a caliphate. In a swift military operation, the sect was decimated, incapacitated, and dislodged from the local governments, leaving remnants lurking around Sambisa forest and isolated communities, mainly in Borno State. The sect is currently engaged in laying of IED or main supply routes to inflict casualty on troops and slow down military operations. As a means of countering the defeat it is suffering in the hands of security forces, and in order to present a viral posture, contrary to government and military claims, ISWAP again stormed Government Girls Science and Technical College, Dapchi, in Yobe State on the 19th of February this year and abducted 110 girls. There are ongoing concerted efforts at rescue operations by security forces to free the girls. Now let's take a look at effects of insurgency on socio-economic and political environment in northeastern Nigeria. The insurgency of Boko Haram, particularly the adopted mode of prosecuting their objectives, have posed serious danger to Nigeria and its citizens as well as foreigners. Some of these effects include rising atmosphere of insecurity, effects on the economy of individuals, the entire Northeast region, as well as the government. The Boko Haram insurgency has also affected social and political life in the entire region. Let's look at insecurity. Boko Haram insurgency has posed serious security challenge to Nigeria. People have been denied the choice of exercising their natural freedom of movement due to fear of attack from members of Boko Haram. Although the spate of bombing has been brought under control, bombings as well as brutalized attack on innocent souls has made residents of the region to live in perpetual fear. Various intelligence reports have, however, shown that some of these attacks are not from Boko Haram alone, but some groups that have been using the privilege of existence of Boko Haram to nurse their personal and ethnical agenda through brutalization of people. It has also been established that there is a strong link between the Boko Haram insurgency and various transborder crimes, especially herdsmen terrorizing some farming communities in Nigeria at the moment. The economic effect of insurgency in Northeast Nigeria has consequential effects on the citizens and the government. The insurgency has seriously affected economic activities of the residents of Borno, Yobe, Adamawa, and neighboring states. Due to insecurity, there has been a massive migration of people from the affected areas to other relatively safer and peaceful parts of the country. As posited by Umaru Ibrahim Yakubu, 97% of businesses carried out in the Northeast were negatively affected by the security problem. This situation needs to be reversed urgently to avert further loss of economic activities in the Northeast region, which will ultimately increase poverty, which could further fuel the Boko Haram insurgency. The insurgency in northeast Nigeria has drastically reduced government's capacity to deliver services and fulfills its obligation as a result of insecurity in the country. Socially, due to security checks, the people have been subjected to long queues at airports, highways, and within the towns and villages in order to forestall any form of mishaps. The activities of the insurgents in the northeast has led to a complete erosion of intercommunal trust vital to building harmonious societies and pulling together community resources for regional and national development. This further resulted in a vicious cycle of violence, poverty, coercion, and instability. Several infrastructural facilities in the region have been deliberately damaged by the Boko Haram insurgents. These include power, education, telecommunication, roads, and other infrastructure. For most of Northeast, the ongoing insurgency has resulted into large migration of expatriates who have established businesses in this region to relocate to other parts of the country, while a good number of them have left the country altogether. The border towns that have thrived on trade and social relationship with neighboring countries have also curtailed their activities due to the insecurity. Furthermore, for a region with dwindling economic and social opportunities, youth unemployment could exceed 60%. In this instance, it is feared that such unemployment youths could only continue to be a steady source of recruitment for the insurgents. Now let's take a look at responses to Boko Haram insurgency in Nigeria. There have been international and local responses to Boko Haram insurgency. Internationally, the United Nations, African Union, Economic Community of West African States, and the Lake Chad basins, and some friendly nations have taken steps to support the fight against the insurgency. Locally, the federal government and governments of Adamawa, Borno, and Yobe states have also instituted actions aimed at addressing the menace of Boko Haram. Let me begin with the international responses. In 2017, United Nations Security Council Committee passed its first resolution on Boko Haram, which was Resolution 2349 of 2017. The Council strongly condemned all terrorist attacks, violation of international human law, and human rights abuses by Boko Haram and ISIS in the region, including killings, abductions, early and forced marriages, rape, sexual slavery, and the increasing use of girls as suicide bombers. Those responsible must be held to account and be brought to justice. Friendly responses by other nations. The government of France, United Kingdom, and the United States have shown individual and collective commitments to assist Nigeria combat the scourge of Boko Haram insurgency. Former President François Hollande of France pledged to give Nigeria and her coalition partners greater support, including military and intelligence, against Boko Haram. The U.S. government also designated Boko Haram commanders Shekau, Khalid, Al-Barnawi, and Abubakar Adam as specially designated global terrorists under Section 1B of Executive Order 13224 on 21st June 2001, and placed a reward of up to $7 million for information leading to the location of Shekau. Similarly, the United States government designated Boko Haram as a specially designated global terrorist organization under Executive Order 13224 in November 2013. The United States has also continued to assist Nigerian military, security, and law enforcement agencies to build capacity to combat Boko Haram insurgency. The United Kingdom government is providing £32 million over the next 3 years to help deliver basic life-saving support, including nutrition, food security, water and sanitation, and protection of civilians affected by the conflict. The United Kingdom government is also providing technical expertise to the Nigerian government to support humanitarian response. France, United Kingdom, and the United States are supporting the military operations in the Northeast with intelligence derived from their intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms deployed in the region. The German government, through its German Technical Advisory Group, has also provided much-needed support in the fight against the insurgency. These supports are in the areas of combat medics, mobile intensive care units, training of combat lifesavers, provision of radar equipment, and counter-IED equipment, to mention but a few. The French summit of 3rd July 2014 was a security summit involving leaders of Benin, Cameroon, Chad, Niger, and Nigeria. It was at the instance of the French President, François Hollande, who encouraged the countries to fashion out global and regional action plan to deal with the menace of Boko Haram. The leaders agreed at the end of the meeting to coordinate intelligence, share information, conduct border surveillance, maintain military presence around Lake Chad, and build capacity to intervene in case of danger. The newly composed multinational joint task force is a product of the summit. African leaders under the auspices of AU, ECOWAS, and the Lake Chad Basin Commission condemned Boko Haram insurgency in Nigeria and its activities on the continent. At the AU Heads of State Summit in January 2015, it was agreed that a multinational joint task force of 7,500 all ranks from Benin, Cameroon, Chad, Niger, and Nigeria would be deployed to combat Boko Haram in northeast Nigeria and the fringes of Cameroon, Chad, and Niger, where the sect is operating. The task force has since been deployed with its headquarters in N'Djamena, in the Chad Republic. The participating countries, except Benin, have deployed troops within their territories. Now, a look at local responses. The federal government of Nigeria and the affected state governments have instituted actions aimed at combating Boko Haram insurgency and ameliorating the suffering of victims of the menace in the Northeast. These actions are kinetic and non-kinetic in nature. The non-kinetic responses. Some of the non-kinetic responses of the government are the diplomatic shuttles by President Muhammad Buhari to contiguous states to garner regional support for the fight against Boko Haram. This diplomatic shuttle saw to the immediate deployment of the multinational joint task force, which has been foot dragging since its establishment in January 2015. The president was also in Britain, France, Germany, and the United States, as well as attended the G7 summit to solicit for global support for the fight against insurgency. Also, the federal government has set up an ad hoc committee to assess the requirements for rehabilitating liberated communities to encourage internally displaced persons and refugees to return to their communities. Additionally, the federal government established the Victim Support Funds under the chairmanship of General T.Y. Danjuma to solicit funds for the rehabilitation of the victims of the insurgency in the Northeast. So far, these steps are yielding positive steps. Infrastructures are being constructed, repaired, and replaced to encourage the return of civil authority into liberated local government areas. Kinetic responses. Military response to Boko Haram insurgency started as internal security operation with Operation Restore Order 1 in Maiduguri, Borno State, and Operation Restore Order 3. Now, let's take a look at some of the challenges. Okay, to conclude, let me look at the way forward. Some of the issues we have are improvement of border patrol and policing, then denial of terrorist safe havens and sanctuary, then control of proliferation, sale and movement of arms, tracking and tracking terrorist financing and their sponsors. Then the last is counter ideology and de-radicalization. So in conclusion, the multinational nature and dynamism of the security environment in Nigeria, as manifested by terrorism and religious fundamentalism, have continued to generate national and international concerns. The insurgency of Boko Haram, particularly the adopted mode of prosecuting their objective, has posed danger not only to the nation, but to the international community, as terrorism knows boundaries. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I've been able to appraise Boko Haram terrorism threat in Nigeria and the federal government of Nigeria to the insurgency, which include both international and local responses to the threat. Some of the significant actions, including employment of the armed forces, enactment of appropriate legislation, and concerted response efforts on friendly nations and international community. The extremist groups operating in Nigeria and their links with foreign terrorist groups and porous borders were identified as the major challenges in the fight against terrorism. Therefore, to ensure that terrorist forces and insurgent groups are on the path towards defeat, we must improve intelligence sharing, border policing, denial of terrorist safe havens and sanctuary, control of arms proliferation, tracking terrorist financing and sponsors, and counter ideology and de-radicalization. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, General Mohamed. That was a very exhaustive and a good presentation as far as the Boko Haram activities in Nigeria are concerned. So we see more of the impact of the terror organizations worldwide is to have some visibility more than to see the consequences of terror. Now, before I open the house for questions, because of paucity of time, we'll take only 2 questions. I have a very small question. Has the religious groups in Nigeria, have they tried doing some kind of presenting a counter narrative so that some kind of de-radicalization is instituted amongst the people who are encouraged to join the Boko Haram?
Yes. As you are aware, Nigeria, we have different levels, sections in the Muslim community. We have the Sunnis, and we have these people from Iran, the Shia and the Sunnis. And basically, these are some of the 2 divisive lines of the Islamic religion. So on one part, we have this extremist. So between the Sunnis and the Shia, there is deeper collaboration, because the Boko Haram insurgents, they consider all other Muslims as infidels. So based on this, both the Sunnis and the Shia, they are forming a coalition to be issuing counter-narratives. And apart from that, the aspect of religious teaching, each time we keep propagating, showing the negative deeds of Boko Haram, citing relevant portions of the Quran and the Islamic books to show that these people are criminals. They are in no way reflecting the teachings of the Holy Prophet. They are not Muslims, and we always feel very bad when the world categorizes common criminals as Islamists. It's one of the correlation that affects the Muslims. When we want to deal with terrorists that are Muslims or supposed Muslims, and we categorize them as Islamists, these are some of the things that are causing problems for us. So clearly, we have segregated them as but common criminals, and we have forged a front. We are doing a lot of counter-narratives, a lot of propaganda, showing that they are extremists and they do not in any way reflect the teachings of the Holy Prophet.
Thank you. Yeah, there. Please introduce yourself and keep the question brief.
I am Subhash Sana, DIG Ops CISF. That was a very exhaustive elaboration on Boko Haram. Those of us who didn't know about it have known about it. But sir, just now you spoke about them as criminals. So what is the difficulty being faced by the Nigerian government in removing the support base of these criminals in preventing the exploitation of women, at least? That is the internationally we know Boko Haram especially for that.
I wish I had ended my presentation. You would have seen what are the issues. You see, part of the biggest challenges we're having today is the isolated and remote nature of these places. So we are already inching towards getting to all these areas where we can take out these places. They are in very, very, very remote jungles. And part of the biggest challenge is the safety of these people. When you go on full-scale military operations, a lot of these people will be lost. And so we've been able, through negotiation, to release a lot of them in the first instance. And unfortunately, before the balance were released, yet another 110 have also been taken again. So complete military action will not really solve this problem, because Boko Haram, they are well trained. They have, to a large extent, decentralized how they have kept these girls. So if military action goes and take a section, we will only be taking a limited quantity, and they will be more careful, and they will hide them in deeper areas. Like the ones they have taken them up not into the some parts of the Chad.
General Mohamed, it's a pleasure to be asking you this question. I too am a retired infantry officer of the Indian Army. I draw your attention, although you have outlined extremely well the entire situation in Nigeria and the region as such. What the international community is very largely interested in today is that after the demise of the ISIS, Daesh, in Syria, Iraq, where is it likely to emerge? Because it has not been decimated completely, it is still existing in a networked form. Earlier theories always said that the surrogacy for the revival of Daesh could very well be anywhere in Africa. Do you feel the Boko Haram or the Al-Shabaab in Somalia are the elements on which the ISIS could depend for a possible revival anywhere in the African continent?
Thank you very much, sir, for that very good question. As at this moment, Nigeria is suffering dearly from this. Following the revolt in Libya, as you are all aware, Libya relied mostly on mercenaries as their security forces in the past. With the dispersal of these mercenaries, most of them have found their way to Nigeria from Libya through this Mali, and they are all here in Nigeria. We have had instances where we have killed mercenaries that are not African origin. We have captured some of their technical support crew, where I think one of them was a Frenchman. So we are facing the same problem as you have said. Now they are forming a very strong foothold in Nigeria, creating a lot of problems for us, bringing in serious experts that are both providing technical support and training, and the situation is not very good. And as you've foreseen, in the event that these fighters have become better trained, better equipped, they are also a source that from now they can export these fighters out of Nigeria to other theaters if they have the need. So that's why it's very important we internationally collaborate and cut this thing out and nip it in the bud.
I think we'll have to put a stop to this. You can continue the discussion during the tea break so that we can move on with the rest of the program. So thank you, General Ahmed Mohamed. Sorry we had to reduce the time frame a little bit because of paucity of time. But we do understand that it's a globalized terror and everybody has to pitch in. Otherwise, Nigeria alone cannot handle it, I would guess. So thank you very much for your good talk. Kindly give a round of applause to General.
Thank you, Major General Ahmed Mohamed, for the insightful address. Thank you, Shekhar Sinha, sir, for chairing the session. I would like to request Admiral Shekhar Sinha to kindly felicitate our esteemed speaker. Now may I request Lieutenant General Atta Hasnain to kindly felicitate our chair. Thank you all. We will begin immediately with our next session for the day, so kindly remain seated. Bottles. Good morning again. I welcome you all to the second session of the day, which is on global terrorism, ideological challenges. To kindly chair this session, may I now invite Captain Alok Bansal, Director, India Foundation, to join us on the dais. Now may I invite Mr. James Dorsey, Senior Fellow, Middle East and North Africa, RSIS, to join us on the dais, please. To our next speaker for the panel, to kindly join us on the stage, may I now invite Mr. Abdul Bari Atwan on the dais. Mr. Abdul Bari Atwan is the editor-in-chief of Rai Al-Yum, an Arab World digital news and opinion website. May I now invite Sayyid Salman Chishti to kindly join us on the stage. Sayyid Salman Chishti is the Gadi Nashin Dargah, Ajmer Sharif, Chairman Chishti Foundation, India. To our fourth speaker, now may I request Mr. Yuvraj Ghimre to kindly join us on the dais. Mr. Yuvraj Ghimre is a renowned journalist and writer in Nepal who keenly follows politics and strategic studies of Nepal. I request Captain Alok Bansal, Director, India Foundation, to take over the proceedings. Over to you, sir.
Terrorism is not some senseless violence. The terrorist does have an objective, howsoever bizarre or outrageous it may appear to be. Terrorists are driven by ideology. It may be radical left-wing, as we used to see in 60s, 70s. It may be subnationalist, violent subnationalist ideology, or it could be extreme religious ideology. Today, the biggest threat to global peace emanates from jihadi terrorist organizations who are driven by a perceived narrative. They believe that they derive a sanctity from a perceived religious narrative, which the terrorist organizations have churned out. And if the mooring of the terrorist from its narrative or ideology is broken, the terrorism could be defeated. Very often, security forces tend to perceive this as a mere law and order problem, treat terrorists as criminals, and they often fail. Because this battle cannot be won by bombs and bullets alone. You have to target the brain. And for targeting the brain, you need to understand the ideology that drives the terrorist. Today, many people have been eulogizing, gloating that ISIS is finished. While the territory under Islamic State's control may have diminished, its influence has by no stretch of imagination diminished. What we saw in Philippines, what we are seeing in parts of Africa, point to the ideological motivation of these terrorist organizations. Unless, of course, we can counter the terrorists ideologically, of course, in conjunction with various law and order means, we'll never be able to win this war. So in this particular session, we are going to focus on global terror, the ideological challenge. Very often people who are not aware of the ideological narratives tend to ignore it. Human mind often perceives what it doesn't know as insignificant. It's not so. I think these ideologies which drive them are very, very important, and unless, of course, we understand these ideologies, we will not be able to counter them. So, I begin the session by inviting Mr. James Dorsey to come and speak. 15 minutes to all the speakers so that we have some time for interaction. Over to you, sir.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be back in India. It's a pleasure to be here, and I owe a debt of gratitude to the India Foundation and to General Hasnain for having facilitated, and thank you all for joining us. Having said that, I fear that the organizers of this conference may regret having given me the honor to kick off this panel. The reason is that I question its very premise. I don't think there is an ideological challenge. The sad truth is that governments, law enforcement, security forces, intellectuals, and journalists do not have an ideological response to political violence as the last reiteration, jihadism. But even if they did, the effort to counter religiously cloaked extremism cannot be primarily ideological. It has to be politics and policy. Complicating things is the fact that responders are repeating their past mistakes. Al-Qaeda produced the counterterrorism industry in the context of a response that was focused on law enforcement, security, and military engagement. It has enhanced, to be sure, that has produced significant results. It has enhanced security across the globe, stopped plots before they could be executed, driven Al-Qaeda into the caves, and deprived the Islamic State of its territorial base. All of that, however, has not solved the problem, nor has it fundamentally reduced the attraction of religiously cloaked extremism. No doubt, social media has provided militants with a megaphone. But let's be clear. Social media are vehicles, media channels. They are not drivers. Yet much like the terrorism industry, the call for a counter-narrative has produced an industry of its own. Like the terrorism industry, it has vested interests of its own. Its sustainability is dependent on the continued existence of perceived real threats. Further troubling the waters is the fact that the public and private anti-terrorism and counter-terrorism industries see human rights as second to ensuring security and safety, have little interest in addressing the problem through notions of alienation, marginalization, socio-economic disenfranchisement, youth aspirations, and basic rights in which counter-terrorism and counter-narratives would be embedded. Aiding and abetting the problem are ever more evident campaigns by non-egalitarian and non-inclusive democratic societies, as well as autocratic Middle Eastern and North African regimes that either have reduced interest in independent analysis and reporting, seek to restrict freedoms of expression and the press, or define any form of dissent as terrorism. The notion that one can eradicate political violence is illusionary. Political violence has been a fixture of human history since day one and is likely to remain a fact of life. Its ebbs and flows often correlate to economic, social, political up and down turns. In other words, counterterrorism and counter-narratives will only be effective if they are embedded in far broader policies that tackle root causes. And that is where the shoe pinches. To develop policies that tackle root causes, that are inclusive, and aim to ensure that at least the vast majority, if not everyone, has a stake in society, the economy, and the political system involves painful decisions, revising often long-standing policies and tackling vested interests. Few politicians and bureaucrats are inclined to do so. Starting with Al-Qaeda's 9/11 attacks, militants have benefited from the fact that the world was entering a cyclical period in which populations lose confidence in political systems and leaderships. The single largest success of Osama bin Laden and subsequent militants is the fact that they were able to disrupt efforts to forge inclusive, multicultural societies, nowhere more so than first in Europe, then the United States with the rise of Donald Trump, and since then with ripple effects in Asia, including here in India. The result is the rise of secular and religious nationalism, populism, greater acceptance of the autocratic or illiberal rule, and the erosion of democratic values and institutions. Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and other forms of ethnic and religious prejudice that no doubt existed, but lived under a cloud of primarily social taboos and have become socially acceptable and often politically convenient. Of course, the refugee crisis put oil on the fire. Nonetheless, what makes this cycle of lack of confidence more worrisome and goes directly to the question of the ideological challenge is how it differs from the late 1960s, the last time we witnessed a breakdown in confidence and leadership on a global scale. The difference between then and now is that then there were all kinds of worldviews on offer: anti-authoritarianism, anarchism, socialism, communism, concepts of extra-parliamentary opposition, and in the Middle East and North Africa, Arab nationalism and Arab socialism. Today, the only one thing on offer are radical interpretations of Islam and jihadism. Human rights activist and former Tunisian president Monsef Marzouki was asked in a Wall Street Journal interview, why is it that not only those who lacked opportunity and felt that they had no prospects and no hopes, but also educated Tunisians with jobs who were joining the Islamic State? His answer was, it's not simply a matter of socio-economic roots. You have to go deeper and understand that these guys have a dream, and we don't. We had a dream. Our dream was called the Arab Spring, and our dream is now turning into a nightmare. But the young people need a dream, and the only dream available to them now is the Caliphate. It's hard to build an ideological challenge or develop counter-narratives if one does not have a dream. With democracy on the defense, free market enterprise having failed significant segments of the public, and newly found legitimacy for prejudice, bias, and bigotry, democratic governments are incapable of credibly projecting a dream, one that is backed up by policies that hold out realistic hopes of producing results. Autocrats are in no better situation. The mayhem in the Middle East and North Africa is not exclusively, but in many ways due to their inability and failure to deliver public goods and services. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman appeared to be holding out a dream for his kingdom, but that dream increasingly is being shattered, both in Yemen and at home. Autocrats in the Middle East and North Africa are about upgrading and modernizing their regimes to ensure their survival, not about real, sustainable change. Elsewhere, populists and nationalists advocating racial, ethnic, and religious purity and protectionist economic policies are unlikely to fare any better. What this means is that identifying the root causes of political violence demands self-inspection on the part of governments and societies across the globe. It is those governments and societies that are both part of the problem and part of the solution. It is those governments and elites that are at the root of the loss of confidence. Translating the need to tackle root causes into policy is proving difficult, primarily because it is based on a truth that has far-reaching consequences for every member of the international community. It involves governments putting their money where their mouth is and changing long-standing, ingrained policies at home that marginalize, exclude, stereotype, and stigmatize significant segments of society, emphasize security at the expense of freedoms that encourage healthy debate, and in more autocratic states that are embedded by the West, seek to reduce citizens to obedient subjects through harsh repression and adaptations of religious and political beliefs to suit the interests of the rulers. The result is a vicious circle. Government policies often clash with the state or regime's professed values. As a result, dividing lines sharpen as already marginalized, disenfranchised, or discriminated segments of society see the contradiction between policies and values as hypocritical and reconfirmation of the basis of their discontent. Creating a policy framework that is conducive to an environment in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia that would favor pluralism and respect of human rights and counter the appeal of jihadism and emerging sectarian-based nationalism is not simply a question of encouraging and supporting voices in the region, the first and foremost among which youth, or of revisiting assumptions of Western foreign policies and definitions of national security. It involves fostering inclusive national identities that are capable of accommodating ethnic, sectarian, and tribal sub-identities as legitimate and fully accepted in Middle Eastern, North African, South Asian, as well as Western countries. It involves changing domestic policies towards minorities, refugees, and migrants. Inclusiveness means that victory has to be secured as much in militant strongholds in a swath of land that stretches from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, as in the dismal banlieues, run-down, primarily minority-populated suburbs of French cities that furnish the Islamic State with its largest contingent of European foreign fighters, in the popular neighborhoods in Tunisia that accounted for the single largest group of foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq, in Riyadh, seat of a government whose citizens accounted for the second largest contingent of foreign fighters, and whose well-funded, decades-long effort to propagate a Puritan, intolerant interpretation of Islam has been a far more important feeding ground than the jihadist thinking and writings of militants like Sayyid Qutb. And finally, in Western capitals, with Washington in the lead, who view retrograde repressive regimes like those of Saudi Arabia and Egypt as part of the solution rather than part of the problem. In territorial terms, the Islamic State has been defeated, but the problem remains unresolved. Al-Qaeda was degraded, to use the language of the Obama administration. In the process, it weakened a jihadist force that increasingly had advocated a gradual approach to the establishment of its harsh interpretation of Islamic law in a bid to ensure public support. Instead of reducing the threat of political violence, the largely military effort to defeat Al-Qaeda produced ever more virulent forms of jihadism, as embodied by the Islamic State. It may be hard to imagine that anything more brutal than the group can emerge, but it is a fair assumption that defeating the Islamic State without tackling root causes could lead to something that is even more vicious and even more violent. Defining repressive autocratic rule and the Islamic State as the greatest threat to stability and security and the furthering of more liberal notions is problematic. In the case of the Islamic State, that definition elevates jihadism, the violent establishment of pan-Islamic rule based on narrow interpretations of Islamic law and scripture, to the status of a root cause, rather than a symptom and an expression of a greater and more complex problem. It is an approach that focuses on the immediate nature of the threat and ways to neutralize it, rather than on what sparked it. It also neglects the fact that the ideological debate in the Muslim world, to a large extent, is dominated by schools of thought that do not advocate more open, liberal, and pluralistic interpretations. That is where one real challenge lies. It is a challenge first and foremost to Muslims, but also to an international community that would give more liberal Muslim voices significant credibility if it put its money where its mouth is. Support for self-serving regimes and their religious supporters, as in the case of Saudi Arabia and Egypt, reduces the international community's choices to one between bad and worse, rather than to a palette of policy options that take a stab at rooting out the problem and its underlying causes. There are no quick solutions or shortcuts, and the value of partial solutions is questionable. The key is the articulation of policies that over the medium term can help generate an environment more conducive to change, rather than the continuous opting for knee-jerk reactions to events and facts on the ground. One place to look for alternative approaches is Norway. In contrast to most reactions to political violence and expression of pro-jihadist sentiment, Norway's response to right-wing extremist Anders Behring Breivik's traumatic attacks in 2011 that killed 77 people stands as a model for how societies can and should uphold concepts of pluralism and human rights. Norway refrained from declaring war on terror, treated Breivik as a common criminal, and refused to compromise on its democratic values. In doing so, Norway offered a successful example of refusing to stigmatize any one group in society by adopting inclusiveness rather than profiling and upholding the very values that autocrats and jihadists challenge. The result of exclusively security-focused approaches, coupled with the expression of economic opportunity by autocratic Middle Eastern and North African regimes and Western governments, is an increasingly insecure region in which the creation of pluralistic societies that honor human rights seems ever more distant. Said an Egyptian Islamist militant whose nonviolent anti-government activism is as much aimed at opposing the regime of General-turned-President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi as it is designed to persuade increasingly frustrated youth that there are alternatives to nihilistic violence. The strategy of brutality, repression, and restricting freedom has failed to impose subservience. It hasn't produced solutions. Governments need to give people space. They need to prove that they are capable of addressing the problems of a youth that has lost hope. We have nothing to lose if they don't. The Egyptians' inclinations pointed towards peaceful protest in favor of a more liberal society, albeit bound by Islamic morality codes. His options, however, left him little choice but to drift towards jihadism. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I'll now request Sri Atwan, the Editor-in-Chief of Arab News Agency, to speak.
Ladies and gentlemen, I really thank Indian Foundation for giving me this opportunity to speak to such a distinguished audience. As a man coming from the Middle East, you know, we are facing a huge problems nowadays. To be a Middle East and to be a Muslim, it means a series of hassles. Wherever I go in Europe, the metal detectives always beeping and flashing, as if they know that I am a potential terrorist. It is too late to be a terrorist anyway, but they don't understand that at all. Anyway, and terrorism becomes a huge industry. When you look at it, there is a lot of think tanks, journalists, experts, security people, conferences, everybody nowadays talking about terrorism and pretending that they have a solution to this global phenomena. But in fact, terrorism is increasing, it is not decreasing, because people who are fighting terrorism, they are actually creating the incubators and the reasons for terrorism. And to be precise here, I am talking about those people who are intervening on our part of the world under the pretext of fighting terrorism, but actually they are arming and they are financing terrorism. During the Cold War, terrorism used to be the Marxism, or actually the Marxism used to be the incubator for terrorism. After the end of the Cold War, Islamic fundamentalism became actually the incubator or the reason or actually the exporter or the practice of terrorism. This is the dilemma which we are facing nowadays. So being a Muslim, it is a potential, potential accusation of terrorism. Other points which I like to refer to, usually we concentrate on the terrorism as a phenomena, but actually we never paid attention to the reason of terrorism. We look at the side effect, but we don't look thoroughly at the real illness or the real problems, which is the incubators, the actual atmosphere, the problems, the causes which actually create or push toward that direction. Now we have a war in the Middle East, a war against terrorism. Who is launching this war? If you look at the situation in the Middle East, why we have Islamic State or Daesh? Who actually prepared the ground for Daesh? It is the American intervention. Now, an American intervention in Iraq, and now in Syria. So when you create the environment for the Islamic states, for the terrorism, here, they are a monster, and after that, you have to fight it. So the other point is also, I would like to talk about, is in Syria, for example, who is the terrorist in Syria? Nobody can give us a clear-cut answer. We have 250 organizations fighting in Syria. The Americans spent $70 billion in training and arming these organizations to topple the regime in Syria. So what will happen if the regime toppled or if the regime stayed in power? How can we are going to deal with these organizations? Millions of arms in Syria now, the most sophisticated arms, anti-tanks and even anti-aircraft. What are we going to do with this in the Middle East? Look at Libya, for example. More than 25 million pieces of arms left after Gaddafi. Where these arms went? To the hands of Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and other radical organizations. So we pretend we are solving a problem, but creating more than 10 or 20 problems. This is the problem. Nobody's talking about this. Nobody's saying, hey, American, what are you doing in Syria? Why are you arming those people? Why are you sending these arms? Why are you sending these all sorts of ammunitions? What will happen to the Middle East? Also, under the pretext of terrorism, they are intervening in our part of the world. They want to divide us. They want to dismantle states and created a lot of states, with the sectarian division. the sectarian motivations. This is the problem. So they want Sunni to fight Shia, Sunni to fight Alawite. They want Alawite to fight Ismailis, and they want Iran to fight Saudi Arabia. So for what? Who will pay the price for this? We will pay the price for this. So it means, you know, a war and after war and after war, and it will be endless of these kind of war. Now, the talk is about the Islamic State. The Islamic State, they told us it will take 30 years to defeat the Islamic State. That the American generals, the American president, the American ministers, they said, yes, yeah, probably 30 years. Now, in 3 years, the Islamic State was defeated. 60 countries were fighting the Islamic State. Now, they don't have Mosul, they don't have their capital in Raqqa, but where the Islamic State gone? Nobody is actually giving us any answer about that. You have the most sophisticated surveillances, the most sophisticated actually intelligence service. Why we cannot know where al-Baghdadi gone? Where is he? Where is his leadership? His, you know, his ministries or his ministers also. Where are they? I'm telling you where. They are going underground. Islamic State, maybe it was defeated over ground, but it is not actually defeated underground. It is very easy. And they are coming to every part of the world. They are going to the branches of the Islamic State, which they were open in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Libya, in Africa, Central Africa, in Somalia, everywhere. So this is the problem. How are we going to face these problems? We used to have them in one place, which is Iraq and part of Syria and part of Iraq. Now, maybe they are in 20 places all over the world, and they will spread terrorism. So did we do a good job? Did we actually were wise enough to root out this phenomena? The big answer is no. I'll tell you, as a Palestinian, I will tell you just briefly the case of radicalism and terrorism. When actually when the Nakba, or the great disaster, took place in 1948, when Israel was established, and about 700,000 Palestinians were kicked out of their territories, we went to refugee camps. I am a refugee person. I was born in a refugee camp. And we were very peaceful, waiting for the international community to take us back to our villages, our towns, our territories, our places. It took from 1948 until 1967, there is no single bullet shot at the Israelis at that time. So we hope that the international community will take care of us. They never. After 1967, groups, the PLO, turned to actually armed struggle. Immediately, we were characterized as terrorists. They were not actually Muslim fundamentalists. They were not actually belonging to any branch of Islamic organization or thoughts. They were nationalists. They were secular. And despite that, they said, no, you are a terrorist. You are fighting. You are using arms. But okay, but we waited for more than 19 years or 20 years, and nobody actually cared about us. Now you are saying we are terrorists? So this is the problem. After that, the Western foxes came to us whispering, look, listen to us. Israel was established by a resolution of United Nations. So why don't you try other path? Why don't you actually try to negotiate, to talk? You want a Palestinian state? Okay, but you cannot have all of Palestine. You can have part of it. So, okay, if you are saying so, we will accept that. What happened? They said, renounce terrorism, we did. They said, talk to your enemy, we did. They said, okay, you accept two-state solution, we did. They said, yeah, you must actually try to fight terrorism. We established security forces to fight terrorism and to protect the Israeli settlers. And after that, they said, okay, now you have to start with autonomy, not independent state. And after that, we talk about the state. Okay, we accept autonomy and not a state in the beginning for a transitional period of 4 years. Look at the situation now. After 25 years of talks, negotiation, concessions, even fighting terrorism on behalf of the Israelis, and what happened? We ended with nothing. Two-state solution collapsed completely. One-state solution is not non-starter. And there are 800,000 settlers on the West Bank. Gaza is besieged. 2 million people actually in a huge cage there. And personally, I'm from Gaza. People are dying simply because they cannot leave to have a proper treatment, and there is no proper hospital in Gaza. Electricity only for 2 or 3 hours only. The water is polluted. The sea is polluted. So this is a disaster. So when you say to the Palestinian, why did you do that? You know, now the younger generation are asking, why did we make all these concessions? Concede 80% of Palestine to get 20%, and we ended with absolutely 800,000 controlling more than half of the West Bank, which is supposed to be the base of the independent Palestinian state. So I am saying, if a terrorist group tomorrow launching attacks, what will happen? Again, you know, we will be considered as a terrorist. And nobody will say why those people actually, after 25 years of negotiation, of concessions, turn to violence. Nobody is asking these questions. If we want to fight terrorism, if we want actually to concentrate on successful solutions, we have to look at the roots, the real causes of terrorism in the Middle East. I'll give you, key words for this. First, people are frustrated in the Middle East. People are humiliated in the Middle East. People actually are suffering from military intervention, foreign military intervention. Wherever there is American or Western military intervention, there are failed states. We have a failed state in Iraq, or a semi-failed state in Iraq. We have a semi-failed state in Syria. We have a failed state in Libya. We have a failed state in Yemen. We have a failed state in Somalia. And God knows where it will be the next failed state. So whenever you have failed state, whenever you have anarchy, whenever you have no central government, so the problem is, this is the best incubation for terrorism. So first, that this kind of intervention should stop. Whatever the pretext of this, in that part of the world, in the Middle East, actually, we are expecting a war coming soon to our part. It could be the third world war. Now the American, and the tension between the American and the Russian in its peak. Yes, 2 days ago, Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, said clearly that if the American attack Syria or attack Damascus in particular, we will retaliate. We wouldn't stay silent. And also the chief of staff of the Russian army said, we have information that chemical weapon could be used by the armed opposition groups, and to accuse the Syrian regime of actually using it, and then the American, the French, maybe the English or the British will attack, and it will ignite a war in that part of the world. I don't want to actually say more. There is a written paper with the organizers. You can look at these kind of things or ideas in details, but I would like to refer to one important thing, which is now in the Middle East, we are like a milking cow, where now there is a tension, where there's intention and intention from the American administration to actually attack Iran, to abrogate the nuclear deal with Iran. What will happen after that? It could be another war in Iran. We don't know. it could be actually Shia against Sunni. The Sunni Arabs in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, probably also Egypt, could indulge in a war against Iran, or a proxy war against Iran. So we have to cough more billions, I don't know, maybe 500 billions, maybe 700 billions. So a lot of arms deals are really prepared to be signed. So it will be, a preparation for milking, for draining all the oil revenues, all the oil, money reserves in these countries. So the picture is very bleak. We need actually, if we want to counter terrorism, we need first good governance. Second, stop the American and Western intervention in our part of the world. Third, we need actually to give people hope, to put an end to employment. We are not responsible to create jobs for the American, for the European. We are responsible to create jobs for our people, our own people. So this is the priorities in that part of the world. I have to end here, and thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you, Mr. Atwan. I think your account from ground zero of global terror was interesting. Though I often wonder why Al-Qaeda and Islamic State have never espoused Palestinian cause. That was the cause for all the problems in the world. I'll now request Shri Yuvraj Ghimiri, who's a veteran journalist and a writer from Nepal, to address the audience, please.
Thank you, Captain Bansal. I sincerely thank the India Foundation for this invitation that I've received, for this great initiative, which I think is an expression of our common concern for a safe future and safer world, where the humankind would feel safer, and also that the nature and with all its resources will be preserved from all kind of threat. But at the moment we are discussing about threat from terrorism and how to counter it. But as we are discussing this issue here, we also need to have a common understanding or common approach on what causes terrorism and what constitutes terrorism. Of course, the situation would be very different from country to country, from a society to society, but any act, I think, that undermines the life, liberty, and livelihood of an individual would be somehow, constitute act of terrorism. And the expectation is that there are laws and there are machineries to counter that. There are justice system to protect those rights. And also, we have, there are, of course, different perceptions about, the previous speakers have said that there are different perceptions about what constitutes terrorism from a place to place. We see things from a victim perceptions and also from the state perception. Nepal has been through an insurgency. Of course, it witnessed that insurgency for 10 years that began in 1996 and ended in a peace process in 2006, but we are still very unsure about the direction it's going to take. But one thing that we witnessed is the gun fell silent after the peace process, peace negotiation in 2006. The insurgents, we call them Maoists, they have come to the democratic process. They are now in the government in Nepal. That's a good sign, because on an average, every day, 7 or 8 people being killed. It was definitely a tragic incident, but the constitution that we have got after that has in a way also given legitimacy to the use of weapons and insurgency method as the appropriate means for political change. There is a fear that this might legitimize similar tendency in future, especially if the governments are unstable and weak and are divided on what causes terrorism and what constitutes terrorism. Initially, like Nepal that was suffering, of course, India is next door neighbor, in the US, these three countries had put the Maoists on terrorist lists. That was removed at various stages by different countries. Of course, we keep saying that there are socio-economic and various forms of disparities. They form ideal situation for a terror group to mobilize people, exploit their sentiments, use them. Vulnerable citizenry is the best breeding ground for this kind of approaches. But then certain mindset also seem to work to exploit that situation and further their political ambition, then actually addressing those grievances. I say that the attack on life and liberty and livelihood of an individual is, of course, that should constitute an act of terror, but public and also attack on public and state property. Those collaborating, aiding and abetting from inside and outside and outside the borders, also somehow giving legitimacy. They would be considered as giving legitimacy to those kind of situations. But then, how did that situation arise? Yesterday, Mark gave a wonderful presentation about terrorism in the age of, like cyber age, all that technology. Of course, technology will always be there, but even without technology, these trends have been visible in, if the change of regime or if causing or inflicting torture on society is the measurements of success that has happened. Poor and irresponsive governance, of course, create a situation for that kind of act. Subversive activities against the legitimate government, legitimate authorities, state order, and weak justice also. That is, I'm purely speaking from our own experience because I think this kind of experience, sharing of this experience will help a lot in devising, the counter-terror method. When the Maoists came to power in Nepal, first time in 2006-07, and then again 2008, now they are a big partner in the government. There was definitely hope that Maoists, there is still hope because they have got the mandate of the people to rule. But what has happened is undermining the legitimate institutions and appropriating those rights of the institutions. Say, for instance, when I'm speaking here, I read in the newspaper very interesting developments back home in Nepal. The Prime Minister called the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and asked him to resign because there are certain controversies regarding his age and all that. The Chief Justice refused, and a secretary of the Judicial Council, directly under the Judicial Council is headed by the Chief Justice, but directly under the instruction of the Prime Minister, declared that the Chief Justice has been removed and somebody else has become the acting Chief Justice. Now, why I'm saying this is the collapse of justice system or executive interference in the justice system will lead to people not trusting in the ability of the state to give justice, and they will seek justice on the street. And that would be another form of, that would lead to anarchy, and anarchy is the best atmosphere that terrorists might use always. So undermining the legitimate authority of the state and the justice system also, maybe, they would be manifested. Terrorism would be manifested in many ways. We have seen that. But then this eruption of anarchy in this form perhaps, somehow disappoints that the peace process and the Maoists coming to the power and the people of the party that people have mandated to rule are not moving in promoting democracy, and defeat of democracy would be an ideal situation for the terrorism to win. That fear still remains in Nepal. Then also, Maoists joining the peace process in Nepal was perhaps a good sign for the region also, because when we are discussing about ideological terrorism, the left insurgent groups together had formed a Southeast Asian platform together. Maoists joining the democratic process perhaps discouraged others, perhaps encouraged some of them also, although it hasn't happened. But then destroying the system from within, destroying democracy from within, and and subverting democracy from within also should be seen as another form of victory or terror path. I know, Mr. Chair, we are running out of the time. I'll not go into details of, what, but then my only concern would be if the use of weapons and violent means would be accepted as means, legitimate means of power change that would somehow, invite peril of democracy, or at least threat to democracy, and creating a situation for terror. Now, almost every leader in the region and outside, in the international forum, in the UN, and says that terrorism, after all, is a terrorism, and there is no good terrorism and no bad terrorism. So any kind of investment, capital investment, or political investment on terror group would again only be promoting. Previous speakers, they have very eloquently and in details given that would establish the legitimacy of terrorism here or there. And so if that doesn't happen, that will vastly discourage terrorism in any shape, anywhere in future. Of course, technology with sophisticated technology would always be used, but it's basically the approach, ideological, political approach, and commitment to defeat terrorism that will form an effective way of countering terrorism. Thank you once again for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuvrajji, for giving that fresh perspective on terrorism in Nepal, which is actually a left-wing, unlike the global terror which we are facing. Our final speaker is Sayyid Salman Chashti, the Gaddi Nashin of one of the most revered Sufi shrines in India, Ajmer Sharif. Over to you, sir.
A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. I begin with the name of the one who is most merciful and most compassionate. I'd like to extend my gratitude and greetings of peace to India Foundation, to Bureau of Police Research and Development, and the government of Haryana for hosting this great platform where experts from our global counter-violence and counter-terror narratives, and our own security personnel who are here, our elders from the armed forces. So greeting of peace to all of you. Considering the time limitations and the importance of this forum, I would just like to go through some very important points, what I have noted down from yesterday. And the place that I come from, that is Ajmer Sharif, most of you know about it, heard about it, and a great Indian spiritual tradition of the Chishti Sufi order that has been serving humanity from last 800 years. Growing up in Ajmer Sharif has been a privilege. At the same time, it's a great learning experience. On our daily interactions, we grew up learning not only about Islamic spirituality or the traditions that we follow, but at the same time, the multi-faith tradition and people coming from all faiths, from the Hindu spiritual traditions, or the Sikh traditions, or all the faiths that are nurtured and grown to the day that we celebrate the diversity in India. So that's the daily interaction that we grow up in. I did my schooling at the Catholic school, at St. Anselm's, and after my schooling days, the first instance of me encountering with the outside world was my graduating years in Mumbai University. Interestingly, it was there with one of my colleagues who was also a Muslim, but when I told him about that I come from Ajmer Sharif, and he looked at me in a very strange manner. That was my personal experience of this ideological challenges that we are talking about here. Then he said that you come from a place which is not part of mainstream Islam. And I was very surprised to learn that what is he talking about? A place which is revered not only by Muslims, but all faith, not from now, but from last 800 years. And this man, a young man who's my classmate, he's an ill-informed person who have no idea about the historical or the spiritual values of the faith that he prefers, that he believes that he's following. And precisely in today's world, when we look around the world, the problem of challenges of these radical outfits who profess or claim to be from the Islamic background or Islamic faith, but they themselves are denouncing and discrediting the faith that they're pronouncing. Recently, in 2015, when we were planning to organize an important event which formally took place under the leadership of Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi Sahab, he was the keynote speaker. It was first time in the history of independent India that the World Sufi Forum, which was organized by us and All India Mashayikh Board, where we gathered about 200 Sufi leaders from around the world, along with the spiritual leaders from India, from Kashmir to South India, at one platform. So I'm going to just share a few of the notes which were shared by the Honorable Prime Minister during his keynote speech, which became the headlines, not only in India, but around the world. This is what happens when global leaders took the initiative of acknowledging and appreciating the spiritual traditions of any faith, as we believe that spirituality has the power to eliminate extremism and all these radical brainwashing, which has been kind of a way of recruiting the youth from any faith perspective. When Prime Minister Modi spoke at the World Sufi Forum, he said that we must reject any link between terrorism and religion. That was his word. He categorically denied that religion cannot be termed as part of any terrorist activity or motivating factors. Another instance that he said that there are 99 names of Allah which have been recited or mentioned in the Quran, and none of them stand for violence. So that again made a headline, and also it was a clear message, not only to India, but to the world, that when you are looking at countering the ideologies of terror, you have to be aware that this is not an attack or this is not coming from a religious point of view. So the message of Sufism was not just contained or combined in combating terrorism, but to encompass the creed of Sabka Saath and Sabka Vikas. That was Prime Minister Modi's words at World Sufi Forum. Because truly, when we talk about the Islamic spirituality and the values that we have learned in Ajmer Sharif, it's about khizmat-e-khalq, service toward humanity. And the langar that is served inside the Dargah Ajmer Sharif, not from now, but from last 800 years, it's a pure vegetarian langar, where people can come together, sit on the same platform, and cherish and nourish themselves with the sacred meal that is served. So the elders have always been very conscious about the heart and the feelings of human being, that none of your action or word should break a human heart. So, continued to his presentation, fight against terrorism must be won through the strength of our values and real message of spiritual traditions from all faith perspectives. Small gestures. Recently, when I was going through some of the news, Prime Minister Modi inaugurated the new BJP headquarters, and during his speech, he took a pause when the azan was being recited. It was a very small gesture, about a minute of pause during his speech. But when I was going through the social media responses to that, some youth from South India, they tweeted in Hindi, I would say that ek hi dil hai hamara, kitni baar jeetoge, Prime Minister Modi. So these small gestures, when you acknowledge and give respect to the traditions that encourage the youth and also the people of different communities to come closer, and also the fuel that has been used by these radical terrorists, that has also been taken away. Because what they do, they portray an image of suffering through some policies or some orientation that particular country or particular leadership is against the faith. And they're making policies to suppress the faith. So this is one of the recruiting propaganda that comes across the line when we talk about these ideological challenges. Being in Ajmer Sharif and having represented India from last 10 years since I've been taken the Gaddi Nashini after my father, Rahmatullah, passed away, in almost 40 countries we have represented India. And it talked about immense forums, how interfaith dialogue and the understanding of clearing the concept of ideological differences that arises will help in a great deal in making the path very clear. We were in Washington in about 2015, and during one of the conferences, we had an interaction with the State Department, then the Obama administration. You must have all read about a gesture of President Obama sending a chadar, a holy covering, at Ajmer Dargah Sharif. That was the first happening from any Western leaders, an acknowledgement of Indian Sufi orders and Ajmer Sharif by sending this greeting of peace at the Urs of Khaja Moinuddin Chishti. What has happened during that acknowledgement, and there are conversations that I spoke with the representative of the State Department, that you are making policies and you're spending billions of dollars in CVE programs, counter-violence extremism, but an acknowledgement and gesture of peace which will not cost you more than $100, but the message will be more than $1 billion. So I left it on that note, and no response came from their side, that we will discuss it and then let it know. Before I was coming from New York to Delhi, I got a call that Ambassador Richard Verma would be receiving us when I come back, and he'll be extending that letter of greeting of peace from the United States President. And that gesture made headlines, and more than 50,000 articles were written about this aspect, not only in India, but global media took this opportunity to cherish and also to write about the positive sides of Indian spiritual traditions, which is acknowledged by the Western world. So these small gestures, which are part of the policy making or the people who are in position to influence the millions of people just by a small tweet, that will make a very, very important contribution. While I'm speaking here, I feel very honored that our work of taking this message to the masses had been made easy by the leadership, current leadership of India. And recently, 15 days back, we were all invited at Vigyan Bhavan, where King Abdullah II of Jordan gave a special remark on moderation. Some of our friends were also part of that gathering. And there again, Prime Minister Modi in his address to the gathering of all the Muslim think tanks, intellectuals from across India were gathered there. And he restated his intention of working towards all communities in India, where he said that he would like to see the Muslim youth holding a computer in one hand and holding the Quran in another hand. So these statements make a great deal in countering these narrations of ideological challenges that we all face. In the center of conflict in West Asia, or the cities in distant countries, in the remote villages of Africa that we just heard about, the problem, or around global regions, the terrorism is a daily threat that we all encounter. Each day brings us terrible news of horrifying images of schools turned into graveyard of innocents, prayers of gathering turned into funeral processions, a call of prayer or azan drowned by the sounds of explosions, of blood on the beach, massacres in the malls, smolderings on the cars on the street, of thriving cities ruined, priceless, heritage destroyed. Since the beginning of the century, tens of thousands of families have lost their loved ones due to this terrorist incident. And in a globally mobile world, one incident can claim citizens of many nations. Billions of dollars have been spent to counter these. But as the previous speakers have said, that this is not decreasing, it is just increasing. The ideological challenges has to be counter-narrative philosophies and spiritual values we have to put into the mainstream. This has to be part of our educative system, universities, schools, colleges, where the youth are interacting with each other. And the importance of active spiritual values life, and India has so much to offer to the world. Without taking much time, I'll just run through some important aspects of Indian spiritual traditions where we can be inspired by the message of Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti, where he spoke 800 years back, with your spiritual light, dissolve the clouds of discord and war, and spread goodwill, peace, harmony among the people. Let's remember the infinite humanism and the Sufi magnificence of Maulana Rumi, where he says, contain all human faces in your own, without any judgment of them. The sermons of Bible, where they ask us to be good, seek peace, and pursue it. Kabir Das Ji, in his observation that a river and its waves are one. Holiness Guru Nanak Dev Ji, prayers that Lord, may everyone in the world prosper and be in peace. Let us be inspired by Swami Vivekananda, appealed against division and for people of the religion to hold the banner of harmony, not of dispute. In the past, we have seen that the Khanika, the Sufi centers of Baba Farid, and the yogis and the sadhus of different ashrams used to meet together, used to learn from each other the breathing practices, the meditative practices. A lot of sayings of Baba Farid are part of the Guru Granth Sahib and the concept of langar, so much of integration into the different spiritual traditions across India. And that is the greatest strength of India that we can share with the world, the unity in diversity, how we grow together, how we cherish and nourish these values. And the world has much to learn through this, and only through the leadership, when that can be amplified and it can make global news on the media, social media, just a tweet about it, that could really motivate the other world leaderships to be part of this narrative of sharing the spiritual traditions. India, again, when we talk about the syncretic culture, over 14.5 crore, the Sunni Sufi Muslim population connected with the Sufi dargahs across India, and practices that would qualify them as Sufis to be believed one of the several reasons that would have firewalled India from the lure of Daesh, the extremist outfits who are attracting the youths from what we say is the Western world or the European countries. Just in 2016, 16 with a report about 1,600 French nationals are reported to be crossed over through Turkey to Syria to join the ISIS. Daniel Benjamin, who is the former counterterrorism coordinator at the US State Department, calls India one of the most amazing and encouraging story in the coexistence between Muslims and non-Muslims. At the same time, the Indian Muslim youths are not being attracted towards any radical callings from around the world. So being the second largest Muslim populated country in the world, it has resisted the group poisoning ideology. Daesh poisoning ideology has been resisted completely. Just maybe 20 names that come from South India, which are not even verified, have been reported or been kind of arrested for interrogation, who might have gone to Iraq to join this fringe element who are distorting. During the World Sufi Forum, a scholar from Morocco talked about the great Indian tradition, where he said India has attained a significant position through this conference, and also the traditions that has nurtured, that all the scattered Sufis were brought against under one platform to denounce the act of terrorism, and also a signed document against that ideology of terrorists by these 200 delegates from around the world was part of the declaration. So that was Sheikh Mohamed Idris from the mosque in Morocco. India's Sufi Muslim numbers are constantly under pressure from the hardline Salafi, which our general from Nigeria talked about, which is one of the ideology which encouraged the Boko Haram to attract the youth toward them. The Salafis, the Tablighi Jamaat, and the Wahhabi stream, the Ahl Hadith. Unlike in Pakistan, where Taliban suicide bombers have attacked Sufi shrines, and the Sufis in India, in particular, have been talked about to the Wahhabi circles or the Ahl Hadith Salafis. As I said, that one of my own classmates, coming from the Salafi background, told me that the place that you come from is not part of mainstream style. So, Alhamdulillah, we are thankful to God that in India, the violent extremism, because attacking these shrines or the integrations of the spiritual values are not yet been seen. And inshallah, in future also, because of the strong upholding of Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb, will not let it happen. And that is one thing that we can share with the world very actively. So just with these few words about the inclusion and understanding, where the Prime Minister concluded his speech about the ethos of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which was acknowledged by the Jordanian king when he said that it was wise, said by the PM, that the world is one family. We have a shared responsibility to each other and the world. Today's global war against terror is a fight by all moderates of all communities and all religion against extremism whose faith is hate and violence. We need to take back the airwaves and internet from the voices of hatred. Take fear seriously, but never distract us from the truth that faith brings humanity together. India and Indonesia are the success stories of understanding multi-faith and cherishing the spiritual heritage. I would just conclude, because there's a 2-minute video that I would like to show. That's how India has cherished and nurtured its spiritual traditions across centuries. And this is especially for the people of armed forces and also the global experts on terrorism. So in Ajmer Sharif, we have grown up with listening these phrases of India. Tera dayar hai dar salam ya Khaja, नई तजल्लियाँ हैं सुबह शाम या ख्वाजा, न फ़िक्र में न गमे जाम तेरे मस्तों को, तेरी एक निगाह से चलता है काम या ख्वाजा. So this is the land of India, where we don't have fear or sorrows. It's the benevolence of the saints and the Sufis and the Bhakti traditions that we as Indians celebrate and nourish. Baza, baza, haranche asti baza, idargai ma umidast, idargai ma na umidinis. Come, 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 whoever you are. Our door is a door of hope. Our door is not the door of despair. So that's what India is, a door of hope to the world. Thank you so much. We can have the video. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chashti Saab. I think we have had 4 brilliant presentations espousing 4 different viewpoints. So we have some time for question and answers. We have about 5 minutes precisely, 5 to 10 minutes. We'll take a few questions. Yeah, I can see the first hand. Kindly identify yourself and then ask the question.
Hello.
Yeah, you can.
I'm M. Kumar, DIG ITBP, and I have a question for Mr. Abdul Bari. Sir, you said that what I have concluded from your speech that there is after Cold War, terrorism-based Marxism has shifted towards terrorism based on fundamentalism. And US has pumped more than $70 billion to add in it. And you also spoke about the misery in Gaza Strip. Sir, you have not spoken a single word about the radical groups actively working in Palestine. My question is, sir, how this problem of Palestine will be solved without containing these radical groups like Hamas working in Palestine? Thanks.
What he said is that how the problem in Palestine will be resolved. But he's asking how the problem in Palestine will be resolved without curtailing groups like Hamas. Curtailing groups like Hamas.
How to deal with it?
How to resolve the problem of Palestine. You could say, we are wired.
No, I'm sorry. Yeah. You know, as I said in my introduction, you know, we exhausted all means of political solutions. 25 years talking to the Israelis, giving them all what they want. 80% of Palestine, we gave it to them. Okay, and we established security forces in order to protect them and also to counter terrorism or violence or arms attacks. In the end, they said no two-state solutions. They said you have to recognize, Israel as a Jewish state. They said also you have actually to live without any border, no sovereign state at all. So what can we do? And you have to accept 800,000 in the West Bank, which is supposed to be the basic of independent Palestinian state. So what can we do? And there is no violence, there is no attacks, there is no terrorism. So what can we do more than that? Just eat and sleep and that's it? It's like animals, for example, without any pride, without any sovereignty, without any state, without any self-determination. We are the underdog. We are under occupation. You listen to Mr. Abbas saying we are authority without authority. We are humiliated. So if tomorrow there is a terrorist organization or armed resistance, whom shall we blame those people, for example? The moderate people in Palestine completely disappeared. They are not there anymore. So because they were actually discredited completely by the Israeli. When the Israelis say there is no peace partner, what do you want the peace partner? What kind of peace partner do you want? This is the problem. I believe the situation will explode and it will be a real problem there. And if it does explode, it will spread to the most of the Middle East. Another thing, as I said, Gaza, honestly, people in Gaza are starving. Honestly, I lost one of my sisters because she cannot actually leave Gaza for treatment because the border crossing was closed. The people, they cannot move, they cannot actually, and they are starving. Literally, they are starving. In one state, the Israeli count calories for the Palestinian. They give the man 2,200 calories and the woman around 2,000 calories in order just to be, in the edge of life. This is the problem. So the solution is for the Israeli to say, okay, those are our neighbors. We should give them independent state as we agreed in Oslo, and we should live together in peace. If they don't want two-state solution, let us have a one state for the Israeli, for the Arabs, for the Christian, for the Muslim, for the Jews, so we can live together and we can actually coexist with each other and on equal footing and under the rule of the law. And, to have election and let the people decide. This is the problem. We offer them everything, but the problem is they don't want that, simply because we are now the underdog, we are weak, and, we don't have arms, we don't have anything to defend ourselves. This is the problem. So it's not our problem, it is the Israeli problem, actually.
You have one.
I just wanted to very briefly add something on Hamas, which does not differ from what Abdul Bari says in principle. Leave aside the vision of what a future Palestinian society should look like. The difference between Hamas and the Palestine Authority is not whether to negotiate with Israel, it's on what terms to negotiate. And the fundamental argument that Hamas has with the Palestine Authority is, you've recognized Israel. You have denounced the armed struggle. It hasn't delivered. With other words, we should not be giving concessions at the outset of the negotiations. That has to be the result of the negotiation. Now, you decide. Both parties are guilty of political violence. You decide whether that's a terrorist point of view or not.
Just finally about Hamas. Hamas was elected. They have been lecturing us for the last 40 years that you have to believe in democracy. You have to accept democracy and the rule of the law. Okay, we had election. Hamas was elected. What the West did? They immediately, didn't recognize it as a government, and actually they put it on the terrorist list. But okay, they were elected in a fair and transparent election. Why we cannot accept them? And now they actually amended their charter. They accept Israel as a state, and they want a state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So Hamas is turning to be a modern organization. So why we don't encourage her to do so and to go on like that? This is the problem. You are pushing Hamas, the West is pushing Hamas to radicalism and to terrorism.
Okay, we have next questions.
Thank you, Chair. I am Sanjeev Tripathi, retired civil servant with intelligence background. I will take on from what the chairman had said in his introductory remarks. We are now this global terrorist groups. We are trying to focus on that, the terrorist groups which have global agenda. Of course, there are other groups operating in different parts of the world which have local agenda. And especially the Islamic, the Muslim groups, they need not be radical groups. They may be, as my friend from Palestine has pointed out, they are not radicals, they are moderates. But what happens when the demands of these moderate Islamic groups are not met? These movements are gradually taken over by the radicals. And that is a danger, so that their demands have to be considered. Now the thing is how to counter the global jihadi groups. That is I think that is what we had to discuss in this session, and what the chairman had said in the opening remarks also, that whether the radical Islamic groups who have global agenda, like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, they can be contained or they can be countered merely by military action or by action by security forces, or the ideology that they are propagating has also to be countered. And here I would like to add, and I would like to have the comments of various panelists, that what do they feel that these global jihadi groups with radical Islamic ideology, can they be countered only militarily? Now they are propagating their ideology, both on the ground by taking control of various Islamic institutions, and also in the social media. They are quoting from holy books. They are quoting verses from Holy Quran to propagate their ideology. Whereas other progressive Muslims are condemning their action. They are not giving any alternate interpretation of those verses. So now this is, and again, this is religion-based ideology. I think we all will agree that being a religion-based ideology, this has to be countered within the religion. Any interference to counter this ideology from outside the religion is going to be counterproductive. So here is, I mean, it's for the, I would like to have your comments whether this ideology has to be countered within the religion and whether the Islamic theorists have to come out to clearly distinguish between the constitutive verses of Holy Quran and the contextual verses. Thank you.
Anyone would like to start with Chashti Saab if he has something?
Hello? Well, I would agree on some aspect of what you have said, but it's when you talk about that radical terrorist organizations or their leaders, they are quoting from the Quranic verses. I would rather say that they're misquoting because there is a clear verses in the Quran, like Rafid Din, let there be no compulsion in religion. So these radical outfits, what are they compelling about? What Quran are they following? That needs to be questioned. And of course, many organizations like from Ijme Sharif itself, we have, as I mentioned in my talk, we have given a signed document with the translation and also the explanations of those verses which are misquoted by these terrorist outfits. So there's a very active campaign which is going on, but at the same time, that initiative and these efforts need support and amplification, whether it is from the world leadership or through the media, the amplification and acknowledgement. Not only defense or offense would be answer to these counter-terrorist strategies. Before that, there has to be an ideological countering and narration before we get into the defensive or the offensive mode. The first edge that we all have is countering, as you said, that within the faith, within the religion itself, it can be countered as to demotivate and completely disseminate these ideological hate mongers from the faith which they are proclaiming to be. That we have to be completely denounce them. And as I said, it's a cultural identity that is more important also that to be researched. As Indian Muslims, we are proud that we are Indian Muslims, and we're also proud that our culture is Hindustani. We don't say that we follow Arab culture. Likewise, for the African Muslim, they are African Muslim, but their culture is very African. Same goes for American Muslims. You cannot force or you can't expect them to imbibe the Arab culture because when they start forcing or implementing the egoistic pursuits, then becomes a problem and there the conflict arises. So we have to cherish our cultural identity, at the same time the religious identity. Once we are very clear with that, then these overlapping and the ideological warfares can be won.
Any comment on this? Okay. Yeah, sure.
I'd like to challenge the premise of both your questions. First of all, the notion of the global terrorist organization. We're not talking about hierarchically structured groups that command troops across a vast geography. We're talking about holding companies with franchises at best. What may be global about them is ideology, pan-Islamic. But then again, these are, at the end of the day, what drives these groups is not religion. Religion is a vehicle. Religion is a way of packaging it. It's not the fundamental driver.
Thank you. I think we have a lot of questions, but for paucity of time, we'll have to wind up here. Sir, we have to wind up. We have next session starting off. We can probably ask them during the tea break, which we will have shortly.
Thank you to our esteemed delegates for such an insightful session. Thank you, Chair, too. Now may I request Captain Alok Bansal, Director, India Foundation, to kindly felicitate our distinguished panelists. To Mr. James Dorsey. Mr. Abdel. To Sheikh Salman Chisti. To Mr. Yuvraj Khimre. And now may I invite Lieutenant General Himalaya Singh to kindly felicitate our chair, Captain Alok Bansal. I thank once again to our esteemed delegates and to the chair. We now will break for 5 minutes tea break. We will reconvene at the earliest for our next session, which is going to be on a session on the changing, we will have sharp for a 5 minutes break and then reconvene at the earliest where the panelists, where we will have our Honorable Sri Suresh Prabhu, Minister of Commerce and Industry, Government of India, and Director, India Foundation, among our distinguished panelists.